Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. This is the podcast produced for Strategy International, a global think tank and consulting firm that brings together great minds from all over the world that work together, analyze, and collaborate on issues of global interest, such as international policy and politics, international relations, security, defense, the economy, the environment, and much, much, much more. Of course, you can always visit www.strategyinternational.org, where you can get a wealth of information on everything that is going on at Strategy International, as well as the entire back catalog of all these wonderful productions. Speaking of great minds, we have another great guest today on the program. We have Sarunas Liekis. He is a Lithuanian historian and political scientist. He's a professor of politics and the dean of the Faculty of Politics and Diplomacy at the Vytautas Magnus University. He's an expert on inter-ethnic relations and conflicts. So happy to have you here, Sarunas. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting.
I'm excited because it's very rare that we actually speak with someone that has the expertise in that region. When we speak about Lithuania, very few people that I know can actually even place it on a map. So it's a very, it's a distinct pleasure to have you here and to discuss, because it's a region where a lot of things are happening these days, given the conflict in Eastern Europe. And I'm very grateful to have you on so that we can discuss everything going on in that region. Let's jump right in, because recently we just went through the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And when we're talking about these regional conflicts happening, or these issues, you're literally next door, not only to Russia, but also to one of Russia's allies, which is Belarus. So I'm imagining that the concern is really, really high for the government with respect to this issue.
I mean, government, I think from the very beginning was not believing that this kind of war, might happen. So this, up to the last moment, probably there was basically let's say political elite was not sure that, this kind of calamity might happen, that this kind of war might take place. And, but this was also kind of unrealistic from their point of view, because I participated in a few conferences just before the war, for example, in October 2021. And one Finnish general came on the stage, and actually the conference was on territorial defense. So I was one of the organizers. One of the Finnish generals came on the stage, and I will not mention his name in this context. So he said, the war will take place. And I am a general of military forces, and I know that the war will take place. If I try to convince you otherwise, I would be wrong, And we as the Finns do everything, to prepare for the future war. Every month, every year, we get better and better, cooperation between, let's say, civil society, NGO sector, government, businesses, etc., to prepare for the future war. And even if we do business with Russians, basically we try to prepare better for the war with the Russians. Eventually, it's like to make money on the Russians. This is good, because it's like we get stronger. So, but this kind of argument was, let's put this way, that was not very well received by Lithuanian crowd. They thought that this guy is probably, too honest, or maybe too kind of defends, this kind of policy of Finlandization, where Finland depends on Russia, neutral, not allied status in the region, and They realized that each of the countries in East Central Europe is ill prepared for any military conflict, because in terms of balance of power, there is no balance of power. I mean, it's all power is on the Russian side, and on probably the balance, you can say, is on our side. I mean, it's like we don't have any, and not much capacity, to resist overall if we go across the region. I mean, Finland basically has the same capacity and had the same capacity as everything, from let's say from North Sea to the Black Sea, including like Romania, etc., etc. So in terms of balance of power, the countries in East Central Europe didn't look very well, but there was a belief in hierarchical international system, and believing that basically, United States are kind of on the top of the hierarchy, and they offshore balancing, like the Brits in interwar period, for example, or just before the First World War, they, would engage in offshore balancing, in a sense, the system. And that this system is pretty stable. However, with the war, it took a lot of time to realize that this is a major crisis, international crisis, and also a crisis not only in international relations, but also in terms of change of all kinds of modes. I mean, also economics, social models, economical models, everything in combination is being changed with this war, and that there is no way to the situation what we had previously before the war. So there was, I mean, still in government, I think there is a feeling that, you can come back to this pre-war normal. But it seems that, the changes that were triggered by this war are of global character, for sure, right now, as it looks. And the perception basically is in the governmental circles, let's say in the political elite. For the political elite, it takes a lot of time to adjust, to the changing situation, because the elites, for example, they were resistant for a long time to any attempt to revise or even to talk about the realities on the ground. In a sense, they presented kind of wishful thinking about international system, the way they imagined the international system is functioning. They presented for the reality. In a sense, they became the victims, or they got captured by their own imagination. In a sense, they started to believe, kind of Hollywood imagery, that Americans at this, flying in with this helicopter, landing and, saving the world. This was kind of imagery which was deeply in the heads. And when we were speaking about conceptual issues, for example, model, for example, for conscription into army, or for example, should army be, professional, non-professional, this kind of disregard for non-professional armies, and what we see in this even war, that non-professional armies are performing even very often better than professional armies, because they, the number of the people in professional armies is limited. They don't have reserves. And well-trained reservists, like in Finnish model, or we can speak about Israelis, for example, for the matter of sake, or Singapore, whatever. These countries are performing much better than all these professionally centered, military forces. So it took a lot of time to adjust, and I think the elites are still undergoing adjustment. So it took a lot of time, up to now, they're adjusting. However, this adjustment is not without kind of ideological biasness. Once again, I mean, many are still clinging to old ways of thinking. The system itself, the whole model, which is based on, let's say, neoliberal economic model, is very difficult. I mean, it has a lot of difficulties to adjust to the realities of the war. So to mobilize anything, I mean, this model is very difficult to mobilize in this model. especially when you need, for example, when you always believe that, you know, offsourcing of services, production, etc., from the state should be producing, you know, good results, because, you know, private sector in itself is much better, more efficient, etc. The government is less efficient. Government is not performing well, you know, trying to create all kinds of, you know, models and also incentives for the consumers to have incentives, you know, to do this or that. So this kind of neoliberal Thatcherian, you can say, new public management permeated the all East Central Europe, basically, and even more than in Great Britain very often, or United States. And right now, everybody realized that this model is not performing. When in time of hunger, in time of epidemics, in time of war, this model is not working. You need state. State has to do all the job, basically. The state has to produce the armaments as well. I mean, the state is a consumer of armaments. Though we would like probably to have a tank or, you know, military jet, but, you know, we're not consumers of these products. So the state is a consumer. So why it's produced by the private sector? And most of the former military industry enterprises were privatized in the due course. I mean, even, for example, if you take Germany or whatever, I mean, in most places, many of them went bankrupt, you know, in this post-Cold War. So there is no capacity, you know, to mobilize. So the state is not able to mobilize. The whole state is geared up for efficiency, like in business, like efficiency. But the state is not result-oriented.
Right.
So there is a difference between efficiency and being result-oriented. And this, I think, is a major, you know, kind of tension. And it has, we see it in the, you know, at the not only ideological elites level, etc., but we see even at everyday level that this, let's say, electorate, the people, you know, who function in representative democracies, they see that the state, you know, those who are entitled to perform and to do, they are not able to do it, because the very model contradicts. Well, we can say in Marx, you know, in Marx terms, you know, that the basis is on its own, and the superstructure is not able to, you know, to perform. It's not able because there is a major clash and major contradiction between the basis and superstructure, and this all over Europe. In the United States, okay, I mean, in Canada, it's a little situation is different, especially like in armaments industry, like United States, it has, you know, economy of scope, protectionist, you know, sector, basically protected by the government, heavily subsidized de facto,
yeah,
you know, with all kinds of exports, subsidies, etc. And in Europe, they functioned, you know, like if they were not bought by Americans, so they were, you know, basically barely alive, you know, for a long time, the whole industry and the whole sector. And I know sector very well. I mean, it's like, at least in East Central Europe myself, I mean, I'm an advisor to one of the associations for the defense industry. So there is, you know, major challenge.
Tell me something, Sarunas, and I just want to go back for a second to what you're saying about that conference where the Finnish general was warning you about a potential conflict. Given the history of the Baltic nations with Russia, how was the relationship before the conflict started between Lithuania and Russia?
I mean, I think we can put in the larger framework. I mean, we can take all the Baltics, all East Central Europe, you know, Poland. I think overall, I mean, for a long time, from the 90s, I mean, business was as usual. However, situation rapidly started to change from approximately 2001, 2003, 4, basically Iraqi war, you know, coalition of the willing, and the whole concept of, let's say, regime change brought by Americans and brought also into East Central Europe. And in the framework of Eastern neighborhood, I mean, this kind of regime change ideology was deeply ingrained, though this was let's say the tool proposed by European Union. This was a tool, Eastern Partnership. But this kind of American, let's say, thinking about regime change was deeply ingrained. So in a sense, the process was rather slow, and this kind of regime change was seen as one of the tools in parallel to, let's say, membership of the neighboring countries into the Western, quote unquote, Western alliance, let's say EU, NATO, etc. And so on many of in many of the countries which were neighboring countries, we had basically clash of the interest, clash with the let's say Russian attempts to change the regime and Western attempts to change the regime in the buffer states like Belarus, Ukraine. Russia itself, was staying away from all that. Because Russia itself is not a buffer state. But in the buffer states, and I would consider, like, for example, South Caucasus also to a certain extent buffer. For example, Azeris together with the Turks, and then Armenians and the Georgians being a buffer between, basically larger Turkish zone of influence and the Russians. So the control of the buffer zones became a kind of though it was not public, nobody would publicly say this. This was not publicly discussed. But because you study it, from different interviews, having conversations with the let's say bureaucracy, NGOs, analysts from different ministries of foreign affairs, etc., you had a feeling that there is this, ideology of regime change. And finally, this rhetoric of, for example, what is the fate of Russia? Everything depends on the fate of Russia in the context of the buffer zones. So Russia, basically, if you go to more radical camp, for example, in East Central Europe or Lithuania, for example, especially with the right-wingers, neocon kind of, neocon supporters of neocon agenda. So I remember very well in 2013, for example, 14, this kind of agenda, to split the Russian Federation, into different parts, so this kind of thinking, that, it's possible to change the regime. Democratic Russia, will become, let's say, federalized in a true sense. And then once they are federalized, you have weaker liberal democratic Russia.
Right.
And this basically was ignoring, overall, the balance of power, the way public administration is constructed in Russia, that it's much more efficient than in, for example, in the buffer zones like Ukraine or Belarus. Very often it's modeled after EU, bureaucracy, and very often on different kind of submodels of America, the way Americans are, running the state. So they ignored, kind of modernization of Russian Federation. But also, everybody basically was ignoring the fact that Soviet Union before and was basically under the Soviet influence. All East Central European borders had been marked, during the times of Stalin. So all the borders are made basically by the Russians in all East Central Europe. And then some politicians, some of them prominent members of European Parliament, etc., they start telling you, look, we'll manage, in having democratic Russia to split Russia. No. On the other side of this dialogue or confrontation, people like Putin would say, look, you are threatening me that you'll split, Russia. I'll split you. Basically, there was no such a dialogue. I'm just inventing. But, in terms of thinking, I think the very logic was wrong from the very beginning. The very logic was ignoring realities on the ground, and especially from 2007, 2008 military reforms in the Russian Federation. And there was no response to that in all the region, and by Americans, by anybody. Everybody was ignoring what is going in the Russian military. Also, Ukrainian events, 2013, 2014, Maidan, failure to sign association agreement with EU, basically, which brought, down the government of Yanukovych, who ran away to Russia. Basically, this balanced the whole, Ukraine. Everybody perceived, the perception was that, yes, it's a great thing in the region, generally, overall. I mean, this was a mood of the people as well. I mean, yeah, it's a great thing, the regime failed, which was pro-Russian, and right now Ukraine is on the way to membership in EU, NATO, and basically to the happy end of Fukuyama's world, in a sense. Basically everybody becomes, slowly everybody gets in the same world. But suddenly, Russian invasion of Crimea, annexation, then events in Donbass, and frozen situation for a few years, Minsk II agreements. And when you start thinking backwards, what happened, I would always ask, were Ukrainians happier in 2013 before overthrow of Yanukovych, who was legitimate president? Were they happier, or are they happier right now? Probably no. I mean, it's very difficult, retrospectively to look backwards, what happened. But in a sense, we have to see what is the result of all the policies. Because, let's say the planners from EU, from NATO, from all major international organizations, peacekeeping, thinking was present, OSCE, Council of Europe, everybody was thinking about the situation. And the result is what we have right now. So what did we achieve with all this? I mean, I'm talking about us. I'm not saying that, this should be thinking of Putin. Putin probably is thinking that he, basically managed to recover what was possibly lost for him.
Yeah.
But, what did we achieve in terms of stability, balance, basically losing the buffer zone, Ukraine losing the status of buffer in strategic, in geostrategic terms. Right now getting weaker. What will be result, we don't know. I mean, the same goes about Belarus. Belarus for many years, I mean, it was a buffer. Basically, everybody tolerated the regime over there. There were, let's say, six, I think, or seven. I mean, don't remember exactly how many elections where Lukashenko, the present president, had been elected, once and once again. And for sure, he was not elected in a democratic way. Yeah. I mean, but suddenly this became an issue in 2020. Why did it become an issue in 2020? My answer is because it coincided with the elections in Lithuania as well. So this was election year. And so basically then opposition and the present government, those who are in position right now, the center-right government and the politicians from center-right government try to capitalize on the events in Belarus and to delegitimize Lukashenko. Basically what they did, they delegitimized him. And basically this way he moved completely into the hands of Putin.
Right.
So two buffers, two balcons, balcony, as if you try to visualize it as a balcony. So one balcony is, let's say, Ukraine on our side, but losing its territory. I mean, lost approximately 20% of its territory right now. The outcome of the conflict we still don't know. We can, basically assess it. There are ways how to assess, probabilities. But another balcony, when we speak about Belarus, is on the Russian side. With nuclear weapons, with everything. And this is from where I sit, right now, it's like probably 50 kilometers. The border with Belarus.
Yeah.
And they have nuclear weapons, these Wagnerites, all these stories, what you were hearing all the time. So did we become more stable, secure, following all these events? In our agitation about certain developments in one or another country. So I think from what I see, I think we lack strategic thinking. I mean, realistic strategic thinking, generally. As a society, as a, let's say, political elite, which is running, the country, one another country, as the bloc, let's say, Western, quote unquote, Western bloc as a whole. From my experience, Though I was usually very critical, I have to be critical. This is my job, it's like, because I'm from academia, etc. So I had to be critical. But when I was criticizing one or another thing, everybody would say, it's like, come on, the Western alliance is the strongest, the smartest, the most technologically advanced, etc., etc., etc. So this was a kind of position, a kind of a very, I would say, snobbish position, with a nose up, it's saying that, look, one of my argument was, look, the Romans saw it the same way, the Roman Empire. When you think that, the sword made out of Damascus is better than the sword made out of low quality steel, sure. But is this enough to strategically to win the war?
Right. Well, now that we're 2 years in, and again, I'm going back to that conference that you spoke about, where everyone was sort of shocked to hear these statements coming from that Finnish general. 2 years later, what kind of impact has it had on Lithuania in terms of the defense policy or the military preparedness? Is Lithuania still in the idea that everything's going to be fine, or is there a heightened sense of alarm that has pushed the government to actually take this conflict more seriously and to prepare more adequately?
Yes and no. On one side, this year, when they started to speak in in terms of urgency, panicking, this 2024 is once again the year of the elections. Presidential elections, European Parliament, and national elections to the Parliament. This was not the case in 2023, and there was, basically there was a repetition of all these kind of propaganda-driven, expectations about Ukrainian victory, counterattack, etc., etc., etc. The concern started, at the beginning of this year, but it coincided once again with the elections, and you don't know to what extent the politicians are sincere.
Yeah.
Most probably not. There are a few camps. You can see those who are in position right now. They are on high alert and panicking. But at the same time, they were in government and they had 4 years to do everything, to prepare, to make because it's preparedness is not only material things, tanks, etc., but also organizational measures. So it's a kind of organizational, let's say, and material capacity. It's a combination of both. So they didn't do anything. And they started, acquisitions, the plans to buy this or that, which is like, extending in time for 10 years to the future.
Right.
And you say that the Russians will attack today, tomorrow, and blah, blah, blah. And what you are doing is at best will be implemented, let's say, in 10 years. Or 5 or 6 or 7. So there is inadequacy. So you have immediate, measures, how you organize something. Okay, you don't have reserve, you need more people, so let's organize 4 or 5 brigades, the organization. You don't need to have any equipment, but just organize it. Organize from the reservists. Start training reservists, etc. But it's nothing like that is done.
Right.
It seems that the usual techniques of planning the budgeting, which just extends every year into the future. And the budget goes on its own, and political screaming goes on its own. Completely interrelated.
So you're saying there's a lack of understanding the urgency of establishing some sort of long-term strategic planning, especially with regards to this conflict. I want to get back to what you're saying with respect to those buffer states, to those buffer nations, and how, at least from our end over here, across the Atlantic, many people have been thinking that this war wouldn't have been caused at all if there were never any talks about EU enlargement or NATO enlargement to begin with. So when we're looking at these buffer states and we're seeing that there are continuous efforts from the EU into gaining, a larger territory, if you see it strategically, or partners, if you're seeing it economically or politically, is that a pretext of perpetuating this conflict much longer? Are we just adding more fuel to the fire? I know that Georgia recently went through the accession talks. I know there's talks about accelerating the accession of Ukraine into the EU as well. So, are we just perpetuating this conflict? Are we shooting ourselves in the foot, or is this done purposely to send a message that we won't be bullied? And we do have the upper hand, and going back to what you said about the balance of power, we shouldn't be taken lightly.
I think it's both. It's both. On one side, the, let's say, agenda, neocon agenda did not move anywhere. I mean, this neocon agenda is still, and the present U.S. administration and the Democrats, you see clearly that they are in this kind of neocon, with this neocon agenda, with all kinds of implications, good and bad. I mean, this is. And we are looking, from the perspective of our interest. Okay, so it's both, good and bad. At the same time, there is understanding that in case Ukraine loses, this is a major defeat for the Western alliance. Everybody would say, okay, you were claiming that NATO is the most powerful, alliance. GDP is of all NATO members and all, all G7 plus, EU, etc., is much greater than Russia. And what happened that we lost? How come that we lose? And this will be a reputational blow, but maybe there is no reputational blow at all. I mean, it's like, look at the situation in Afghanistan after 20 years. I mean, you come in, you overthrow Taliban, and you leave after 20 years. Your regime collapses the same day when your last plane flies away, and you got Taliban once again in power, and there is no consequences whatsoever. So maybe there is no consequences. I mean, if even, in a larger sense, Western alliance loses. I mean, the major hegemonic power can afford to lose.
Mm-hmm.
They can afford, but they are still the most powerful.
Right.
But this is about, let's say, regional power and those countries who are on the edge, of these events. So, if the border moves like 150 or 200 kilometers one or another direction, it has major consequences regionally. It doesn't have consequences for the hegemon. The hegemon is still fine.
Yeah.
And then kind of in the south from where you are, so the hegemon is still okay. It's both ways. There is ambition. There is an attempt to change the situation with its own what means are in the hands of European countries. But at the same time, when you look at this kind of longer perspective from 2013, in 2013-14, everybody was saying that Russians don't have any power. They are, they're orcs, schmorks, and they are weak. I mean, they cannot win against the West, etc., etc. Right now, there is another extreme saying that the Russians will attack NATO, EU. They will, take everything. This is after 10 years. But there is no on the ground. There is no change in terms of reality.
Yeah,
on both sides. Russians have what they have. Okay, they lost a lot of resources in the war. They have, they are gearing up economy for wartime. EU is not able to mobilize, still planning the same way they were planning 5 or 6, 10 years ago. So what actually changed?
It's interesting that you're mentioning this because recently the French president, Emmanuel Macron, came out and said that perhaps we should consider putting boots on the ground for the NATO alliance. He was quickly put into place by a lot of the partners saying that no, we're not going to go there. But he did have, some call it audacity, courage, whatever you want to call it, as the perhaps only leader to have actually suggested it. Was he testing it out to see people's reactions? I don't know. But the fact that you are putting it out there is maybe an indication of maybe future plans or an alarming state of affairs where you see that there's nothing moving tangibly. This war has been going on for 2 years and the conflict regional for even longer. Maybe it's about time that we mobilize and put an end to it. You know, I don't know. I mean, how has this been perceived in the rest of the European countries? The suggestion that he made.
There was, the whole content of this meeting was basically leaked by the Slovak president, by Prime Minister Fico. And from what we know from the Greeks, the Greeks were saying that basically that a few countries basically supported this kind of French initiative. These were the Baltic countries, the Poland and Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be kind of the British tradition of offshore balancing. This is for sure. I mean, this and the way they were functioning through the ages in European politics. But when we talk, the Poles immediately backed out. They said, we're not gonna do that for sure. And the Baltics, there was, we're ready, blah 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 blah. Okay, but the Baltics are the weakest link in the whole story. And we just can speculate, for example, if, and Putin was actually during his speech, to the Federal Assembly, yesterday, explicitly said, I mean, if anybody moves, will use, nuclear weapons or whatever measures, is in our disposition. So you can imagine what would happen, for example. Okay, 100 Estonian or Lithuanian soldiers go, for a training mission into Ukraine, and then Ministry of Defense in Tallinn gets bombed, for example, by the Russians. Yeah. Ballistic missile comes in, and what are your actions of officers? So immediately, will anybody start the war? I mean, Americans backed out. NATO said, this is not NATO operation. NATO is not supporting that. So you will be, in the position of basically of the bite, basically left alone. And from on your example and on the crisis created by you, somebody else will capitalize.
Right.
Very recently, I mean, there was one analyst, the Polish analyst spoke about the example of 39. He said, come on, I mean, the British and the French had convinced us that, they will support us in case we go to war against the Nazis. And we went against the Nazis and they backed out.
Right.
They left us alone and they, waited because they were not prepared for the war. And they used the conflict with us to prepare for the war against the Nazi Germany. So, So this kind of, so I mean, this analyst did not go as far as to say that yes, we probably should sign, Berlin Pact, and anti-Comintern, and join the Nazis, but he didn't go as far as that argument. But there are a lot of interests in the field. So I would say, in terms of national interest of small and mid-sized countries, many of these suggestions are very dangerous. I mean, it's like you can be sacrificed on the bonfire, for of larger configurations in the region, and then nobody will remember that you Cyprus, Cyprus history, etc. So, so there is a danger of that, and the fact that many some politicians in some of these countries are kind of positively disposed to this kind of idea shows, I think, immaturity of the political elites and the kind of, I would say, infantile thinking. They think these are computer games. These are not computer games.
Yeah. It's interesting what you're saying, because tangibly it seems that nobody can really see any result. So in your opinion, what are we expecting in the next year, 2, 3 years? How is this conflict going to evolve or even maybe end?
I think, if there is no kind of serious armistice, we should start, with armistice, at least, on the ceasefire and armistice. But with this kind of ceasefire, there is a problem. I mean, what is a long-term strategy on both sides? On Ukrainian side, and then eventually the Western side, and the Russian side. Russians have, in mind basically change of the whole power configuration in Europe. Basically, they want they're down to earth. Their idea is to get rid of Americans from Europe, to get throw out Americans out of Europe. with all this kind of action. I mean, and this kind of in traditional geopolitics, it would mean that Eurasian continent in itself, without, it's much better to do without the islanders. Okay, the US and British, they are the troublemakers. So this kind of traditional geopolitical thinking, which is not alien also to the French geopolitics. The French geopoliticians usually are, when they were speaking about, Europe from Portugal to Vladivostok, or Lisbon, to Vladivostok, this is kind of traditional, European geopolitical thinking, the islanders are in trouble. But at the same time, they are not able to do anything without these islanders. Because in East Central Europe, especially, you have the so-called the Great Barrier, for between Western Europe and Russia and eventually China. China is not interested in losing this barrier, then it would strengthen the Russian interests generally. Russia would be strengthened, and they don't want the East Central Europeans to lose against the Russians, the Chinese, though they have an interest, in, let's say, in land communications, because all these belts, whatever Chinese investment into the roads and ports, etc., this is kind of, to be free from possible sea blockade. So in case, for example, the, Filipino, Taiwan, whatever, they are blockaded by the United States, their thinking is that they still will be much better off than, the Japanese were during the Second World War, when they were basically on the island without the resources,
right,
and basically blockaded by the major sea power at the time, rising sea power, United States. So there is a lot of geopolitical thinking involved, and I think both Germans, from what I see, at least Germans, I think they see that there is a possibility to accommodate, the interest of everybody, and to find, kind of modus operandi, how, to make a major deal, settlement, etc. Naturally, it will happen at the expense of smaller and mid-sized countries. They will be, put in the position that probably, at least in terms of their imagination, they shouldn't be there where they are.
right.
I mean, I'm saying, for example, Ukrainians, etc. Okay, your expectation were to be a member of EU, you're being told that you'll stay neutral, whatever. Good example probably is Turkey. Everybody would say, why did you have all this trouble? You could have acted as Turkey, growing your, resource base, becoming stronger organizationally and militarily through the decades, and then, you get liberated naturally. But this kind of thing, strategic geopolitical thinking, is alien for the majority of, let's say, neoliberally thinking elites in Europe. Generally, they don't get this kind of. Erdogan is alien. It's the same like thinking of Orban, which is also this, kind of a lot of strategy involved in Orban. Also, a lot of I would say strategic ambivalence. This is also a tool, to maneuver in this kind of situation. But in case like most of the EU countries, and especially in East Central Europe, who don't have strategic ambivalence, so you cannot negotiate anything from both sides. You are clear cut. You are too well seen. It's like everybody's look from the American perspective. I mean, it's like, what? Come on, this is easy.
Tell me something going forward now for Lithuania and maybe even the Balkan, the other Balkan states. There have been impacts, obviously, that have been caused because of this conflict. How does a country like Lithuania, that depended so much on resources coming in from Russia, how do you plan for a sort of sustainability in energy or any other natural resources without Russia?
I mean, the trade with Russia is not closed completely. I mean, the imports and exports through the third countries, it's still, the circulation is, I mean, there are, the whole categories which are under the sanctions of the goods, but still, from what I see, the business is overcoming. I mean, you don't have like military communism, in place, and state-run, systems on both sides, and basically the businesses are like innovative, etc. So you see that this is going on one side. On the other side, the economy of Lithuania is open economy, so it's good and bad at the same time. But the most of the capacities, for example, like in energy sector, okay, this Green Deal, green cause, green direction of development in energy sector. I mean, it elevates in parts. Then connectivity to the northern and western Europe. Energy connectivity, like for example, for example, oil refinery in Mažeikiai, which is one of the largest business in Lithuania, is in the hands of the Poles. I mean, the Poles, redirected, let's say supplies long time ago, to all the factories. It's Orlen company group, right? They merged, Lotus and Orlen, 1 year ago. So it's one of the major, one of the biggest companies in Central Europe. So they redirected everything long time ago. So there is no direct impact that you are losing something, but you are losing in terms of macro competition. For example, the fact that you closed, a nuclear power station, in 2008, 2009, and then you could have run it like for 10 or 15 additional years, plus building the second, section, the second reactor. You would need all this Green Deal. The Green Deal is based on the basically subsidies from the European Union, for green, and for Green Deal, it requires around probably, to make this change in 50 years, you will need something 17 to 18 billion. And then instead of, having all this for 5 billion, you could have built another, reactor and run, all your needs, electricity needs. I mean, you don't need all this, panels on the roofs, all this, machinery that is, brought also from China, and we don't know how to recycle all this as well. I mean, this is just the beginning. So I would say, they were strategic decisions. I mean, many of these decisions were wrong from the very beginning. I mean, they were heavily ideological. I think Green Deal, I mean, I don't want to sound that I'm against, green agenda completely. But I want to say that I think it's a lot of ideology involved in it. I mean, it sounds, for me at least, I mean, I was, studying a lot, for example, the Soviet practices, for example, the Soviet ideological, the way Communist Party operated and so on. I mean, I see a lot of parallels, between EU thinking and let's say the thinking of the Soviet communists.
Mhm.
I mean, at least, you can see clearly that this kind of ideological mindset, which is not, it's detached from reality.
Right.
You decide that semiconductors is not a good, direction for development, your economy, you drop it, you cut it off, you don't fund it. So the same is, is Green Deal. So, and then, when you have basically centralized kind of approach, where everybody runs after your subsidies provided by EU or by EU states, then, you create the bubble, everybody runs. I mean, there is some innovation, but down to us, I mean, look what is going on in India, in China, in Canada, wherever. I mean, it's like, if you're burning coal and you grow more trees, I mean, you're still fine.
Right. I don't want to take up too much of your time. What are some key issues right now that are dominating the political discourse in Lithuania? Is it still dominated primarily by the war, or are there other pressing matters that is being discussed?
There are. It's interesting that war, is very important. It's dominating, let's say, public discourse. The way, for example, president talks, prime minister, this kind of. You feel that war is in the background, but many pan-European developments. For example, this strike of the farmers against green agenda, which is pan-European phenomenon. Lithuania touched upon. I mean, and they got scared. I mean, the general reaction of the government that they immediately started, to, in a sense, started to understand that this is serious. I mean, and right now, for example, today the Polish farmers started blockading Lithuanian border, not to allow, Ukrainian grain to get into Polish territory via Lithuania, because Lithuania was also, saying, yes, we're helping Ukrainians, but in a sense, not sending via port. This wasn't, I don't know to what extent this story is true, but it seems that it's true. And actually, the documents are rewritten and then everything sent back, to Polish territory and go westwards, or, unloaded in Poland somewhere. They start. So this kind of, let's say, strike and dissatisfaction and politically motivated and ideologically motivated dissatisfaction with the Green Deal and with green, let's say, arrangements for and this strategy 2050, etc., all this EU level. And in particular countries, I think it makes influence, it changes the scenery, and I think this kind of, very often it has this kind of socially conservative issues and values related, to the outlook, how society should function, the outlook of the society for the future, the role of the family and all this, the whole discourse with all this is changing. Because you realize that, it's like, in order to survive, to function, and to work, you need to have fighting force. You need to have industry. You need to have productivity. Not only blah blah blah, and to service economy. And and I think it's also the clash between those who are living on rent. It's like, okay, financial sector, for example, and those who are working in productive sectors. And this has all, and also there is another cut. You can see that the international businesses, let's say, for example, if you work for, I'm just giving a rough, we don't have this kind of industry here. For example, if you're working for Apple, so you have a little bit different perspective than you are working for the local business, which is, producing, has workforce, has, let's say, grows trees, etc., locally. So you can see that there is this major kind of divide between, let's say, globalists and anti-globalists. Those who are locals, they say, we don't give a damn shit, sorry to say this way, but, we don't give a damn about this, let's say, your agenda, because it's not ours, it's imposed by somebody.
Right.
By neocons, Washington, D.C., whatever. Schwab, with Davos, and, this kind of, though it was for a long time, it was very kind of marginal views for a long time. And I think with this war from 2021-22, it became more and more, visible. And it became, it lost the kind of this kind of, I would say, shining aura of political incorrectness. For a long time, it was like politically incorrect, like to attack Davos.
Yeah.
Right now, everybody's attacking. When you go to podcast, for example, everybody's against Davos, against Schwab, and this green agenda and deal, da da da. So the world is changing for sure. The world we thought is completely fixed and going to the happy end, happy whatever end of the happy beginning, I think it's this tendency will not survive. It seems that right now, and many countries will have to adjust, including United States. I think Trump is not a Trump. Trump as a Trump. Very often, Trump as a Trump. Trump is an expression of the problems in the United States. If not this Trump, then you would have another Trump. This is, it's very often, we get this kind of personalized. The same, here politicians as well, they get personal. That's somebody's personal problem, that you state this or that. But this is not only, this is a kind of expression of the problems on the ground. Societal problems, economic problems, developmental issues, issues of sustainability. The way, for example, we, understand sustainability. This is. So many things, I think are changing, and we go, I think, in the direction, at least for a while, of this kind of essentialist, short or mid-term, let's say future, where you go to the basics. You need a father, with an axe to defend your house. You need kids, to work on your farm. It's like, so who will work? So etc. You need mother who takes care of the kids, so it's the whole, this kind of vision that, yes, I mean, we have shortage of labor, let's bring somebody, from Libya, for example, or from elsewhere, and then it's natural we start, program, we teach them our values, and then they, well integrate into our society. In some cases, yes, in some cases, no, but, depends very much on the effort. But this kind of thinking is going away very rapidly. I can see it, in different international formats as well. And I don't want to say that this is good or bad, but this is a kind of a tendency. This is a tendency. This is tendency, and the older tendencies, I think they are being replaced and very rapidly.
That's interesting. And I was going to end, but now that you brought up, maybe a last question for you.
Sure.
This growing sense of nationalism, and we're seeing it pretty much across the world, but specifically to Europe, we're seeing it especially in the eastern part of Europe. Is that, in your opinion, is that a threat to the EU centrist model that has, for a very long time kind of survived?
I think yes. I mean, this is because it touches upon the issues of sovereignty, and I think the very idea of sovereignty, that we decide about how things should be done in one or another place, country, etc. EU, for example, European Parliament is not providing for, let's say, for true sovereignty, because they function, they function in different mode. They are not representing, in a sense, electorate. Then the European Commission is also in the air, from the point of democracy. And the idea and the talk that, we should get rid of veto right, because it obstructs our common decisions, but then it's the question of whose common decisions.
Right.
Yeah, whose common decision? There is no EU without the EU member states. So it's a kind of, we agreed on the rules and we go along the rules. And, along our agenda, for example, our interests, etc., etc. But in case, for example, you go away from the principle of sovereignty, you go in the direction, for example, of the majoritarian decision making, I would say then, technically speaking, bigger states, let's say, I'm just giving an example. I'm not meaning that French are bad or good or whatever. I mean, but for example, big states will realize their interests at the expense of the smaller and mid-sized countries. This is like, I mean, if in everyday situation. So how to accommodate everybody and to solve the issues, without losing sovereignty, this is another issue. This is a problem. I mean, very often those who are very pro federal agenda in European Union, they say, look, was Germany better during the 17th century when there were 2,000 states, in the present German territory? I'm putting roughly, I mean, this Holy Roman Empire. But, or are they better off right now? But I would say also during the 30-year war, I mean, each smaller state was much more powerful than any Count Margraf, whatever. I mean, with his troops, or hired troops, mercenaries. He was much stronger than all, I think, EU leaders taken together right now.
Yeah.
Because he was running his own place. He was, father of the small whatever country, nation, you can put it differently, of Hessen, for example, the king of Hessen. I mean, he was much more powerful. He was running his own place. Everything was his. The vassals and the whole system. I mean, I'm not just taking, I'm also giving, this. And this kind of mentality is absent right now, in Europe. So, and my point is that I think if you put alliances together well, I mean, 10 small states, but strong states, then can function much better than, 10 lousy states, disorganized and completely being under the control, for example, of the Germans or of the French or the British, whatever. So this is some question of perspective, I think, but politicians will be afraid, I think, to lose the right of veto. I mean, overall. I mean, and this is all of East Central Europe. I think, for example, the countries of Visegrad, Hungary, and, Slovakia, and even present-day Polish government, I don't think they will be big fans of, federalization. Though the government changed very much, the previous government was strongly anti-German, let's say, in general, and anti-EU,
Yeah.
But, when you look at, and the next government in Czech Republic, I think we will be Eurosceptic. I would be afraid even, of kind of Czech exit, they can go. I mean, the Czechs are always keeping in mind that this present Czech government, which is liberal, center-right liberal government, is the least popular government historically. So it's in Czech Republic. The same like in Lithuania, the present government, which is center-right, is the least popular. For example, the leadership of the prime minister, the minister of foreign affairs, which is like Landsbergis, for example, who is perceived like very, kind of internationally, very often he has different agenda. Let's say his perception internationally is different than locally. Locally, he's the least popular politician in Lithuania.
Right.
So these are the statistics. Minus the ranking minus 79. You cannot go down. I mean, anyway.
Yeah.
It's impossible. So there is a certain crisis of legitimacy as well. I mean, of this kind of liberal agenda, global agenda, neocon agenda. So I think, and in East Central Europe, because of the differences in interest, if to compare with the Western European interest, because Western Europeans naturally feel much safer. I mean, everybody in Portugal understands that the Russians will not come to Lisbon. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah. But if you're on the border, if you are Hungarian prime minister, Czech prime minister, whatever, you have to think about these issues. So I would be, skeptical that there is an option unless let's say European Commission and the major powers in Europe, the bigger states, will find a way, somehow to get a deal, serious. But I mean, just joking about it as a corruption in a sense. You pay off, okay, let's get rid of your voting rights and we, give each country, 100 billion, sorry, not million, 100 billion. And then, we're done. But keeping in mind the economic troubles in Germany and elsewhere in Europe right now, I mean, and because the whole model started to collapse, for example, the productivity, energy consumption, etc., everything is changing right now.
Right.
And apparently the whole Green Deal is, a failure as well to a certain extent, not completely, not 100%, but it's a failure. So how the political elites and the governments will act, we don't know.
It's definitely going to be very interesting. And on that note, I want to thank you again, Sarunas, for taking the time to share your wisdom with all the listeners and all the viewers, whom I invite once more to visit www.strategyinternational.org. Go and see the beautiful things that are happening over at Strategy International, the entire back catalog of numerous productions that are available to you. Sarunas, thank you again so much. I really
thank you, George, for inviting and being with me and asking good questions.
Thank you so much. Hopefully we can do it again soon.
Sure. My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye, George.